Welcome to Atheist Witch, a podcast for witches or any curious minds to learn more about a non-theistic approach to witchcraft. I'm sharing my journey as I find my way between actively practicing witchcraft and navigating a non-theistic viewpoint. I will review some basic foundational concepts, but this is not intended as a podcast for brand new witches. I will never present my or others' opinion as fact, and any positions represented in this podcast will be referenced accordingly. Please keep in mind that just like yours, my practice is ever evolving, and my stance may change over the course of this podcast. I'm always happy to discuss this or answer any questions. Please reach out to me on social media or email. Hello and welcome to episode 4, Witchy Basics as an Atheist. Today we'll be discussing some foundational witchy concepts like correspondences, rituals, and altars from the perspective of a practitioner who doesn't worship deities. Thank you for joining me today for this episode on witchy basics. I'm aware that my intro says that this podcast is not for beginner witches, but today we'll be delving into some of the first topics that someone may encounter if they're new to witchcraft. However, I definitely plan to take a specific angle on these topics as an atheist witch. In one of the earlier episodes, we spoke a little bit about isms, in terms of atheists, agnostics, and other theists. Today, I'd like to discuss other labels you might encounter in the witchcraft world, specifically how witches label ourselves. You may have heard everything from a white witch, black witch, green witch, to a lunar witch, death witch, hedge witch, kitchen witch, etc. ad nauseum. Witches have made an art form out of labels, and new ones crop up probably every day. The reason I bring this up is to establish a concept that I will return to time and again. As a witchcraft practitioner, you, and only you, get to determine what kind of witch you are and how you wish to label yourself, if at all. You are also free to choose as many names for yourself as you like. My personal selection from the grab bag is a nerdy, eclectic, green, hedge-riding, atheist, sometimes animist, skeptical, and science-seeking kitchen witch. This is a good time to mention one of my capital O opinions on a divisive topic in the witchcraft community. It's also timely because the next episode will be all about the history of witchcraft. You may encounter individuals who claim to be hereditary or natural witches. This means that they come from a family of multi-generational witchcraft. One or both grandparents, etc., were witches and may have passed on their knowledge. This is a wonderful way to learn about their practice and grow up in the craft. However, this does not mean that a hereditary witch is in any way better, more powerful, or more correct than someone who is first generation or even someone who is self-taught. Witchcraft is incredibly personal, and in my mind it should stay that way. Every witch is a natural witch, and every person can practice witchcraft. Okay, rant over. Speaking of names and what we call ourselves, you might be wondering why I haven't described myself as pagan. Strictly speaking, a pagan is someone whose religious practice lies outside the mainstream religions, and it can include atheists and folks who follow a nature-based path. For myself, however, I do not really consider myself religious, and in witchcraft circles it's easier for me to describe my beliefs with the term atheist. Another good descriptor is one that I mentioned in earlier episodes, and that's atheopagan. Other types of pagans include, but are definitely not limited to, heathens, shamans, animists, asatruar, druids, Hellenists, and Wiccans. There are thousands of pagan religions going back literally to the dawn of humanity. If you're pagan and you're looking for community, the Paganism subreddit has a Discord server, has a lot of channels for all kinds of different faiths, including those who are eclectic or self-made. Something I've enjoyed about the pagan community is that for the most part, pagans are willing to live and let live. It's uncommon for one pagan to attack another for their beliefs. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, pagans are a pretty accepting bunch. Let's move on to discussing some of the fundamental witchy concepts. I'd like to say that as an atheist, one is absolutely free to pick and choose how these things are incorporated into one's practice. I will obviously be speaking from my own perspective. Among the first things a lot of witches learn are the 4 and sometimes 5 elements: fire, water, earth, air, and sometimes spirit, also called ether or akasha. The elements are often called at the quarters during the raising of the circle, and they feature heavily in a lot of witchcraft aesthetic. The elements have always resonated well with me, and I find a lot of joy in incorporating them into my practice. I use the elements to invoke emotions and concepts useful to my workings and my life. Fire is taught as an active element, one of passion and power. Its color is traditionally red and direction is south. It's closely associated with the sun for obvious reasons. Water is typically seen as the malleable, ever-changing element of emotion, associated closely with the moon because of her effect on the tides. Its color is blue and direction is west. Earth is the northern element, usually green, representing strength and stability. Air is intelligent and quick, yellow, and is in the east like the dawn. Spirit, or ether, is the 5th element. It doesn't have a specific direction, but it's sometimes considered the connection between the physical and spiritual realms. Traditional colors for spirit can be purple or white. There are many, many more concepts corresponded with each element, and we'll talk more about correspondences in just a moment. I use the elements in a lot of different ways. Elemental associations have a lot of binaries and opposing pairs that help me to feel a sense of balance in myself, my home, and my life. I want to make a quick side note here. Witchcraft is full of binary viewpoints, and in a world where we have more and more people who would like to step outside of binary classifications for themselves, I believe it's very important for the witchcraft community to evolve and help create space for those individuals. I plan to discuss this in more detail in an upcoming episode about the future of witchcraft, which will include the goddess and god deific binary. That said, I don't mean to demonize the use of binary pairs to create the sense of balance, which is something I frequently do for myself. The simultaneous confluence of fire and water, earth and air helps me remain a neutral combination of all the qualities that I wish to inherit. I don't often invoke spirit, so from here on out, when I'm referring to the elements, I'm talking about fire, water, earth, and air. In practice, I have many altars to the elements around my home that serve to remind me of this goal and give me a moment of pause and reflection. I can also use these places to meditate or focus on specific qualities or concepts that are useful to me in the moment. For example, I may choose to focus on fire if I need to summon my personal power, or I may reach for earth if I need to feel steady and strong. If you listen to part 1 of the Science and Witchcraft episode, you may recall what I said about the power of color on a person's mood and mindset, and the power of scent over memory. These are 2 ways in which elemental associations help me achieve the results I'm looking for, as I've developed strong elemental color and scent associations in my mind. I also have a traditional representation of each of the 4 elements on my altar in order to evoke the same qualities and sense of balance in my ritual and spell work. Fire is easy to represent using candles, but can also be represented by a wand. Water is fairly obvious, but may be kept in a cup or chalice, a bowl, or even a cauldron. Earth is traditionally represented by salt or a pentacle. Air can easily be represented by incense, or you can use a feather, a traditional knife called an athame, or a sword. For quick workings, I double dip by using a dish of salt water and an incense censer. Let's talk more about correspondences. Correspondences are associations between concepts that are intended to influence each other, and often are used as supportive components in magic. So what on earth does that actually mean? This might be easier to explain with an example. A witch doing a working for protection might seek to include a color or objects that will support the purpose of the spell. Black is often a color for protection, so the witch would select spell objects like candles in the color black. Black tourmaline is a common protection stone that might be included, and plants such as basil, garlic, or rosemary. There are astral correspondences too, so the witch may choose to do this working under the full harvest moon, or on a Saturday under the noon sun. There are far, far too many correspondences for me to list in one episode or in many episodes. Fortunately, if this is something that interests you, there are countless resources available that document correspondences from all sorts of perspectives. However, as you may imagine, there are some conflicting sources as well. You might find one source that says citrine is great for money spells, but another source might not mention money at all and recommend citrine for protection or psychic power. You might find yourself wondering where all these correspondences come from and how anyone knows if they're right. If you've been listening to me so far, it might not surprise you that my recommendation is to first and foremost determine what correspondences resonate with you and your own practice before reaching for a resource written by someone else. The easiest place to begin, in my opinion, is with color associations. Grab your grimoire, sit down, and spend time visualizing each color. You can close your eyes or even look at an object in the color that you're focusing on. And when you're ready, start writing down the words and concepts that come to you. You may find that for yourself, green is the color of creativity or freedom, or that purple feels like love and friendship. Given everything we've learned about the power of color on our brains, these associations will probably work much better for you than something that you pulled from a book, however well-meaning the author may be. Similarly, you can extend this practice to stones, plants, elements, moon phases, numbers, tarot suites, or anything else that helps you evoke the emotions and the mindset that you need for your workings. An example from my practice is my use of the rose. By the book, rose, which can be one of multiple species of flower, represent everything from love to creativity to fidelity. In my workings, however, I often use rose as a plant ally that represents myself. Obviously, this usage is nuanced, as oneself can mean a lot of things, but in my practice, I tend to use it as my aspirational self. For those who have listened to my special bonus episode about Imbolc, you may recall that my purification bath includes dried rose petals. Given that the bath is intended to simultaneously release and absorb qualities out of and into myself, the scent of the rose helps me place my mental and emotional self into the working. Correspondences are one of those things you can create and keep learning about for the rest of your life if you wish. They can provide a highly impactful component of your spellwork and overall practice. The next commonly learned witchy concept that I'd like to discuss is celestial bodies, specifically lunar and solar phases. I'll save astrology for a future episode. What do I mean by solar phases? In some cases, witches will associate days of the week with various spell purposes, but in my case, I'm mainly speaking about the time of day. Why would the time of day matter at all? I have two reasons for your consideration, and one is a little more woo-woo than the other. First of all, most humans have some type of association with the time of day, which, as we've learned, can help you get into a specific focus or mindset. For example, for myself, the dawn is a time of quiet contemplation, when the air is cool and the dew is on the leaves and the light is growing over the earth. Dawn is best for workings of peace, creativity, and growth for me. The second reason I think the time of day is important is due to some of the factors I discussed briefly in the Science and Witchcraft episodes. If you haven't listened to those episodes, by the way, I encourage you to go back and give them a shot. The concepts I went through in those episodes will come up again and again, and I will speak about them in greater detail as we go on. Our sun emits electromagnetic waves continually over a wide range of wavelengths, some visible and some not. Some penetrate the earth, some don't. So when the earth is between us and the sun, such as at midnight, we receive a different level of this electromagnetic energy than when the sun is high overhead. Now, I won't sit here and claim that I understand all of the potential effects and ramifications of these differing levels of exposure on our brains and our bodies, but it does stand to reason that there is an effect, and you may find it interesting to note any impacts on your workings at different times of day. Similarly, scientists have long noted the impact of the moon's gravitational force on Earth. The tides are highly influenced by her position, but it may surprise you to learn that even mountains are subject to that irresistible force. So again, it stands to reason that what impacts the world around us similarly impacts us. In fact, the etymology of the word lunatic, as in luna, another name for our moon, was lunaticus, or moonstruck in Latin. as a person who is believed afflicted with periodic insanity based on changes to the moon. Naturally, just like times of day, different moon phases may have personal associations for the practitioner as well. A dark moonless night may lend itself to different workings than under a brightly lit full moon. I encourage you to choose your spell timing in whatever way suits you best. It's also important to remember that the sun also has a gravitational force on us, and the moon sometimes reflects back the sun's radiation in the form of light. As we move through space relative to these celestial bodies, we may find varying degrees of impact on our spell work, on our environment, and ultimately on us. So these are the main reasons I account for things like moon phases in my workings, both personal associations and potentially scientific ones. And also a tremendous reason that I take so many notes. Traditional ritual and spellcraft usually involves the invocation of some kind of divine being, whether it be the goddess or a specific deity chosen for their association to the working or the practitioner. Often, a witch or a practitioner entreats the deity for the power needed to cast the spell into the world. Sometimes the elements are similarly invoked, summoned and released in order to cast a protective circle during the ritual. You may be wondering how an atheist witch believes that any spell work could be successful without a deific powerhouse present to provide the necessary oomph. To begin to answer the question, I want to quickly point out the difference between invocation and evocation. You've heard me mention evocation several times in this episode alone, usually in the context of bringing a specific emotion or mindset to the surface for the purpose of spell work. So, evocation is to give rise to an internal force or call up an emotion. Invocation, on the other hand, is to call forth an external entity or power, such as the calling of a deity or elemental. The key point here is that evocation in this context is to bring forth a part of yourself, while invocation is to rely on something external to yourself. To put it bluntly, I believe that the source of power for my spell work is myself. In some respects, I might consider that the power of my environment and surroundings have an impact as well, in as much as they have an impact on me. However, I don't consider it effective to just sit and believe really hard. In my ritual and spell working, I still find it helpful to call up and generate my personal energy to back up my intention and manifest my desired result. There are a number of methods to generate personal energy, some more fun than others. Things like singing, dancing, meditating, anything that evokes your desired mental state and generates some physical or mental energy. I usually envision energy in this context as heat, so in evoking my own power, I seek an activity that sort of heats me up, physically, emotionally, or mentally. On that note, sometimes you can engage the help of another person, if you catch my drift. Not to put too fine a point on it, but once energy is generated, it helps to draw it to a climactic conclusion whereby you can throw all that effort and emotion into your intended result. This can take all kinds of forms, but in essence, the spell is the build-up and the finale is when it's cast. For example, picture dancing ecstatically until you just couldn't dance another step, and then you cast your spell using all of that energy before collapsing in a heap, confident that your working will be successful. Another example is getting into a deep meditative state in order to perfectly hone your focus and draw up as much mental energy as possible for the working. You can tailor your evocation to your intended purpose, but the overall concept is that drawing up and spending energy is what will help the spell work stick. Some practitioners prefer to visualize drawing up energy from their surroundings, by the way, in order to avoid expending their own life force. For myself, I haven't encountered an issue using my own power, and so this is the method that I use. Although witchcraft can and should be done anywhere, many witches prefer to keep an altar as a specific place for their rituals and spell work. I've already mentioned my mini altars for element-specific meditation or workings, but I'm also one of those witches who prefers to have a primary altar in my main working space. As you can probably imagine, my altar is free from deific imagery or statuary. I don't see anything wrong with using the image of a specific deity to evoke a desired result, but this is not something that I choose for myself. I do, however, take a lot of joy in decorating my altar for the season, and I usually take the opportunity on a given Sabbath to do some specific ritual or spell work related to the season. Have a listen to the bonus episode about Imbolc for some examples. Also on my altar are representations of the 4 elements, as I mentioned earlier, as well as whatever aesthetic items are making me happy at the moment, and whatever items are supportive of my spell work. I typically have some type of altar plate or paten to contain my spell work, and due to the energetic nature of my spells, I also have a chalice and a small plate for post-ritual refreshments. If you follow my Instagram, I'll post some photos of my altar at various points throughout the wheel of the year. At several points in this episode, I've mentioned ritual as it pertains to spellwork. Ritual itself is certainly not limited to witchcraft. In fact, most world religions are established on a firm foundation of dogmatic ritual and doctrine. I'm looking forward to exploring some world religions from the atheist perspective in future episodes. However, in this episode, I am discussing ritual common to witches and some other pagan practitioners. Ritual in this context are the activities and actions taken, often in a prescribed sequence and in a ceremonial fashion, that invoke or evoke some desired result. Rituals may or may not be focused around spellwork. One of the more common rituals in witchcraft is the casting of the circle. Note that not all witches or pagans feel it necessary to cast a circle, but because this episode is all about topics that are often encountered early in a beginner witch's experience, I thought it would be helpful to include. A circle is a protective, energetic bubble around a practitioner and their tools that provides a safe space to conduct their spellwork and other ritualistic activities. Casting the circle usually involves purification or consecration of the ritual space, calling forth the elements, called the quarters, drawing the circle itself and raising the power, and invoking the goddess and god to attend the rite. Taking down the circle involves the same activities but in reverse. Because I don't believe that I require protection from supernatural entities, because my workspace is absolutely saturated with my personal items, scents, and energy, and because I don't invoke deities, I don't find it necessary to cast the circle for my own workings. On occasion, I may find it useful to draw a mental shield between myself and my environment, if only to block out the noise and give myself the mental space to focus. In these cases, I will sometimes borrow elements, no pun intended, of the ritual circle casting to suit my needs. Other common rituals besides circle casting are those specific to a Sabbath or a holiday, or the consecration or blessing of items pertaining to the craft. Rituals are usually rote and repeatable, and they provide the framework around which spellcasting is done. I use rituals to create the right environment and for getting myself into the emotional and mental state that I desire for my workings. The last but not least topic that I'll cover in today's episode is the Book of Shadows, or Grimoire. This is a witch's book of spells, as well as a lot of other information specific to a given witch. The term Book of Shadows came from Wicca, but it is fairly widely used in the pagan community, and it's often used interchangeably with grimoire. It seems everyone has a different opinion on this topic, so I won't go too far into the potential differences. I myself have several books that I consider grimoires or books of shadow. I still have several books I inscribed by hand when I was part of a Wiccan coven, and I have one giant post-bound volume that I created around that time using printed pages. In my modern practice, I have several small handwritten journals that I use for actively recording spell work, herbal wildcrafting, dream journaling, or just writing down whatever comes to mind. I also have a printed volume of my own construction. As a quick reference, it sits next to my altar. And I have an absolutely massive collection of information that I store in the cloud as my primary grimoire and magical record. I think it's important to find whatever works for you and not allow yourself to be influenced by others in this particular matter. As you might expect from listening to prior episodes, I find it incredibly important to take a lot of notes on everything from your spell work to your mental state, so I recommend selecting whichever methods suit you best. I've added a poll to this episode on Spotify asking all of you if you'd like any deeper dive into any of the topics that I went over today from the perspective of an atheist witch. Please check out the poll on Spotify and let me know what you think. That's all I have for today's episode on witchy basics as an atheist witch. I hope you've enjoyed this unique perspective on common witchcraft concepts. I hope you'll join me in a couple of weeks for the next episode, History of Witchcraft. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. The best way to support this podcast is to please like, subscribe, or leave a review. Follow or message me on Insta at anatheistwitch or email me your comments and questions at anatheistwitch@gmail.com.